The ink had dried unevenly on the notice, puckering the paper where Eleanor's hand had pressed too hard, and the smell of it, sharp and mineral, like something dragged up from the earth itself, stayed with her long after she'd tacked it to the post outside Harding's general store. She stood on the boardwalk in the October chill and read her own words one final time, as though they belonged to someone braver than she was. Notice of arrangement. Widow, 31 years, holding 120 acres east of Caldera Creek, seeks a man of industry and honest character for a working arrangement. Terms to be discussed. Inquire at the Caldera Creek post office. Ask for Eleanor Marsh. She had not written the word marriage. That had been deliberate. Marriage implied sentiment, and Eleanor was fresh out of sentiment. What she had was a mortgage coming due in the spring, a well that needed recasing before the freeze, and 40 head of cattle that required a man's full strength to manage through the winter. She also had a daughter named Clara, 9 years old, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and who had told Eleanor plainly that morning that she did not want another father. Eleanor had told her, equally plainly, that she was not offering one. She was hiring help. Help that would live in the house because there was no bunkhouse. Help that would share meals because there was no cook. Beyond that, she had not thought too carefully, because thinking too carefully had a way of convincing a practical woman that practical things were impossible. 11 men answered. She would learn that number on a Tuesday, when Postmaster Glendon handed her a stack of envelopes bound with twine and said, without inflection, that she might want to sit down. She did not sit down. She carried the letters home, set them on the kitchen table beside Clara's arithmetic book, and read every one while the stew simmered and the wind tested the window glass. 10 of the letters told her what the men owned, what they could lift, and what they expected in return. The 11th letter contained 3 sentences and a silence that felt almost rude. My name is Wyatt Cale. I am 34 years of age. I can work. That was all. Clara read it over Eleanor's shoulder and said, he forgot to brag. Eleanor folded the letter along its original crease. Yes, she said, he did. She wrote back to all 11. But she wrote to Wyatt Cale last, and she wrote his reply longest, which she did not examine too closely at the time. The 10 other men arrived across the following 2 weeks, singly or in pairs, driving wagons or riding hired horses, hat in hand on her porch, speaking in the careful, measuring voices of men who had already decided what they wanted, and were waiting for her to agree. One brought a bottle of rye as a gift, which she did not consider charming. One brought a written list of his own requirements, which she considered honest but discouraging. 2 were too young. 1 was too certain. Eleanor thanked each of them, fed them a meal because it would have been unkind not to, and sent them on their way with a handshake and no promises. Wyatt Cale arrived on a Thursday in late October, on foot, carrying a bedroll in a canvas bag worn smooth at the corners from long use. He walked up the road from town, which was 4 miles, because he had come in on the southbound stage, and the stage did not come as far as Caldera Creek. He arrived at the edge of her property at mid-morning and stopped at the fence line, as though he understood that crossing it was not something to do uninvited. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window. She dried her hands on her apron and went outside. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the particular quietness that comes not from shyness, but from long habit of economy. He had a weathered face that had spent years outdoors without complaint, and eyes that were a pale, clear gray, the color of sky before snow. He held his hat in his hands. He did not say anything. He simply waited, which was, she realized, already somewhat unusual. "You're Wyatt Cale," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You walked from town. Stage doesn't come out this far." "You could have hired a horse." "Could have," he agreed. Eleanor studied him for a moment. He did not fidget. He did not elaborate. He had the stillness of a man who had made peace with silence and found it adequate. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He crossed the fence line only after she turned and walked back to the house, and Clara, watching from behind the parlor curtain, noticed that he closed the gate carefully behind him. She told Eleanor this later, in a whisper, as though reporting intelligence from enemy territory. "He closed the gate," Clara said. "The others didn't." Eleanor pretended not to hear, but she had already noticed. She laid out her terms at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, because she had learned that talking and drinking coffee at the same time left her with an excuse to pause when she needed one, and she intended to need none. She spoke plainly. He would have the room off the back of the house, previously used for storage, which she had cleared and fitted with a cot and a small iron stove. He would take his meals with them because there was no separate arrangement for that. He would have full authority over the cattle and the outbuildings and the well repair. She would handle the finances, the household, and the correspondence. She would not be supervised, second-guessed, or countermanded. He would be paid a fair wage from the spring revenue, assuming the cattle were sold at a decent price, and the mortgage was met. She paused. "I expect you to stay through at least 1 full year. After that, the arrangement can be renegotiated." Wyatt Cale looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands. "What I need to know," he said, "is whether the well's hit bedrock or whether it's just gone shallow." Eleanor blinked. "Gone shallow. The casement's cracked on the south side." He nodded slowly. "That can be fixed. Takes 2 days, maybe 3 if the ground's already frozen. It hasn't frozen yet. Then I'll start Monday." She opened her mouth to ask whether he had any questions about the arrangement, any objections, any additions. He had none. He shook her hand across the table, a firm, unhurried grip, and said, "I'll do right by the place, Mrs. Marsh." He did not say he would do right by her. He said he would do right by the place. Eleanor told herself that was the correct thing to say, and did not think about why it settled in her chest the way it did. He started on the well Monday morning, as he had said. He was outside before Eleanor had put the coffee on, and she found him at the well casing with a lamp and a measuring rope, making notes on a scrap of paper with a blunt pencil. He had not asked for tools. He had found them in the barn and assessed them on his own, and set aside the ones he needed in a neat row beside the wellhead. Clara stood at the kitchen window eating her oatmeal and watching him with the candid stare of a child who has not yet learned to be subtle. "He wakes up before people," Clara announced. "Some people do," Eleanor said. "Papa didn't." Eleanor said nothing. She poured her coffee and did not look out the window and told herself she was not keeping track of which mornings he beat her to the yard. She kept track anyway. Every morning that first week. It was all of them. He fixed the well in 2.5 days, working in the thin autumn cold with his coat off for the parts that required reach and flexibility, and he did not ask for help but accepted it without comment when Eleanor held the lamp for him on the second evening, the light failing too fast to finish alone. He told her where to hold it. She held it. They did not speak much. When he set the final section of new casing and tested the seal, he said, "You'll have good water through the spring," and she said, "Thank you," and that was all. But she felt something release in her chest that had been clenched since August, when the water had started coming up cloudy, and she had understood what it meant. She cooked supper that night. Venison stew, which was what she had, with bread she'd made that morning. She set 3 places. Clara sat across from Wyatt and studied him with the focused attention she normally reserved for arithmetic problems she found suspicious. "Do you talk at supper in your family?" Clara asked. "Clara," Eleanor said. "I don't have family," Wyatt said. He said it without self-pity, the way a man states the direction of wind. "But I don't mind talk." Clara considered this. "What do you like to talk about?" Useful things, he said. Mama says feelings are useful. There was a brief pause. Wyatt looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her stew. Your mama's probably right, he said. Clara appeared satisfied by this and went back to eating. Wyatt ate his stew without comment, but Eleanor noticed that he had a second bowl, and she noticed further that he said, quietly and without ceremony, that it was good. She told him the venison had been tough and she'd added too much sage. He said he hadn't noticed. She suspected that he had, and had decided not to mention it, which was a form of kindness she had nearly forgotten existed. November came in cold and deliberate, the way trouble tends to arrive. The first frost hit the second week, hard enough to silver the grass and send the cattle moving in close to the fence lines for warmth. Wyatt had already prepared for it. He had reinforced the barn doors against the north wind, laid extra bedding in the stalls, and built a second feed bin out of spare lumber he'd found stacked behind the barn in a quantity Eleanor hadn't known she had. He had done all of this without being asked and without announcing it, which meant she discovered each thing separately and experienced a separate small shock each time, like stepping on a step you didn't know was there in the dark. Startling, but never a fall. He did not explain his preparations. He did not expect praise. When she remarked one morning that the new feed bin was a good idea and she wished she'd thought of it in September, he said simply, ground was too soft in September, wouldn't have held the posts. It was a practical answer. She appreciated practical answers. What she did not appreciate, or rather, what she appreciated too much for comfort, was the chair. She had one armchair in the parlor. It had been her husband's, and she had kept it as much from habit as sentiment, though she rarely sat in it, because it had been built for a larger person, and she felt swallowed by it. Wyatt said nothing about the chair for 3 weeks. Then, on a Saturday when the wind was too fierce for outdoor work, she came in from the chicken house to find him in the barn, with a draw knife and a length of white oak, fitting pieces together with the quiet concentration of a man who has decided something and is acting on it without needing permission. "What are you making?" she asked. "Chair," he said. "We have a chair. You have one chair," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the wood. "You sit in the parlor at night," he said. "Clara sits on the floor." "That's not right." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. She said, "The materials." "Found them. Stack of oak behind the second stall. Dry enough." She stood there for a moment, feeling something she could not name and did not try to. She went back inside and fed the chickens and peeled potatoes and tried not to think about the chair, and she thought about it all evening. He finished it in 4 days. It was a good chair, straight-backed and solid, fitted together with wooden pegs rather than nails, the seat just the right height for a 9-year-old girl. He carried it in on a Wednesday evening and set it by the parlor stove without a word. Clara sat in it immediately, folded her hands in her lap with great dignity, and said, "It fits me." "Made too," Wyatt said. He went back to his supper. Eleanor looked at the chair. She looked at the man who had made it. She looked back at her stew. She told herself it was a practical object. She told herself it was entirely within the terms of the arrangement. She told herself it meant nothing beyond the ordinary decency of a man who disliked disorder. She told herself these things all the way to December, and December did not believe her. The trouble with Harlan Goss had been brewing since before Eleanor posted her notice, though she hadn't known it then. Goss ran a cattle operation 12 miles north, along the upper creek bed, and he had made it his quiet business for 2 years to accumulate land along Caldera Creek until he controlled the water access that half the smaller ranchers depended on. He had bought 3 homesteads outright, foreclosed on 2 more through a lending arrangement that local men discussed only in private, and had let it be understood, without saying so directly, that the marsh acreage was on his list. Eleanor had known this. She had not told Wyatt. She should have. Goss sent a man named Durbin to the ranch on a Friday in the second week of December, on the pretense of asking whether she had cattle to sell. Durbin was a civil enough man in the way that a drawn curtain is civil. Something was happening behind it, and you were not meant to know what. He sat in her kitchen and drank her coffee and made conversation about the price of beef in Silver City, and then, as though it had just occurred to him, said that Mr. Goss had heard she was finding the ranch difficult to manage, and that Mr. Goss might be willing to make her an offer on the property, a fair one, generous even. Eleanor said she had no interest in selling. Durbin said that Mr. Goss had also heard she'd brought in outside help, which sometimes indicated a property was in trouble, and that his offer would remain open. It was at this moment that Wyatt came in from the barn. He had heard none of the conversation. He came in because his afternoon work was finished and he wanted coffee, and he stopped in the doorway, reading the shape of the room with those pale gray eyes of his, in the way she had come to understand meant he was cataloging things before he spoke. He did not speak. He looked at Durbin. He poured himself coffee. He sat down at the table. Durbin, to his credit, did not flinch, but something shifted in him. He finished his coffee a little faster than he'd intended, said it had been a pleasure, and stood. "Tell Mr. Goss," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level, "that the Marsh property isn't for sale. Not in trouble. Not interested." "Yes, ma'am," Durbin said. He nodded to Wyatt on his way out. Wyatt nodded back, said nothing. After the door closed, Eleanor stood at the window and watched Durbin ride back up the road until he was a dark shape and then nothing. "That wasn't about beef," Wyatt said. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Goss?" She turned. "You know about him." "Heard of him, before I came." He turned his coffee cup once. "You should have told me." She had no defense for that, and she did not offer one. "I wasn't sure how long you'd stay." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I told you I'd do right by the place." "I know. That includes knowing what it's up against." She nodded once. She felt the shame of it, and then, underneath the shame, something like relief. She sat down across from him and told him everything she knew about Harlan Goss, which was more than she'd told anyone, and he listened without interrupting, asking only 2 questions, both of them about the creek access and the survey markers, and when she was finished, he said he thought they had more ground than Goss realized, and that a proper survey in the spring would settle it. She said she didn't have the money for a proper survey. He said, "I do." Eleanor looked at him. He looked at the table. "It's not charity," he said before she could object. "It's investment. If Goss takes this property, I'm back on the stage with nowhere particular to go. I'd rather spend that money on something that holds." She did not say that she was not merely a property. She did not say that. She understood what he meant, and she understood also that he had a way of saying the practical thing that carried, underneath it, a warmth he had not yet found the words for. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They drank their coffee. The stove ticked. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall, slow and quiet, the way mercy sometimes comes. Wyatt rode to town in early January to file a formal complaint with the Land Registry Office against Goss's claimed survey of the creek boundary, and he carried with him the survey markers Eleanor had kept in a coffee tin under the floorboard of the bedroom, stakes her late husband had driven in 1887, with the county seal still stamped on the metal. She had not told anyone she had them, not the bank, not the postmaster, not the preacher who had occasionally suggested, gently, that she might find it easier to sell and take a smaller place. He rode back on a Thursday through 6 inches of new snow, and when she heard the horse on the road, she was at the kitchen window before she knew she'd moved. Clara was beside her, pressing her nose to the cold glass. "He came back," Clara said, as though this had been in doubt. Eleanor said nothing, but she had put a fresh pot of coffee on an hour earlier, when the light started to go, and she had not examined her reasoning. He came in stamping snow from his boots, shrugged off his coat on the peg by the door, the peg she had put up for herself and which he had claimed on his second day, and which she had not objected to, and had in fact put up a second peg for herself that same evening, and sat down at the table. "Registry accepted the markers," he said. "Goss's man filed a counterclaim, but the registrar said it'll take a favorable survey to overturn original stakes. We get a surveyor out in April. That creek line is ours." Eleanor put the coffee down in front of him. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. "You could have sent a letter with all of that," she said. "Could have," he agreed. There was a pause. He looked at the coffee. She looked at the window. "Thank you, Wyatt," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She had not planned it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor." Just that, just her name. But the way he said it, carefully, as though he had been holding it and had decided it was time to set it down somewhere safe. She felt it in the center of her chest where the fear had lived since August, and the fear moved over to make room. February was the hardest month, and also, Eleanor would think later, the best one. The snow lay heavy and the roads were impassable for 10 days running, and the three of them, Eleanor, Clara, and Wyatt, were snowbound together in the small, warm space of the house, and there was no avoiding each other, which turned out not to be a problem at all. Clara taught Wyatt checkers. He was, she reported, terrible at checkers but showed improvement. He taught Clara how to splice rope, which Eleanor considered an odd skill for a child but could not argue with, since Clara was radiantly pleased by it. Eleanor read aloud in the evenings from the 2 books she owned, and Wyatt listened with the focused attention of a man who reads slowly and savors it, and once he asked her to read a passage again because, he said, he'd missed a word, though she was almost certain he had not missed anything at all. On the 8th night of the snowbound stretch, Clara fell asleep in her new chair by the stove, and Eleanor covered her with a quilt and did not move her because she was sleeping too soundly to disturb. Wyatt banked the fire. Eleanor washed the supper things. They worked in the kitchen together in the comfortable near silence they had built over 4 months, handing things back and forth without needing to speak about it. And when the kitchen was done, Eleanor dried her hands and turned and found him standing close, in the way that happens in small kitchens, and neither of them moved. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "When you answered my notice," she said, "you wrote 3 sentences. Every other man wrote half a page." He was quiet. "Why so little?" she asked. He looked at the window. The snow was still coming down, soft and relentless, pressing against the glass. "I figured you'd had enough of men explaining themselves," he said. "Figured you could tell more from what a man didn't say." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "I could," she said. "I did." He turned back from the window, and his gray eyes were very direct and very still. "I came here because I read what you wrote," he said. "You didn't ask for romance. You didn't ask to be saved. You asked for someone who could work and be honest." He paused. "I thought I could do that." "You have," she said. "I want to do more than that," he said, "if you're willing." The kitchen was very quiet. The snow pressed at the window. The stove ticked. "The arrangement," she said slowly. "What you're saying would change it." "Yes," he said, "it would." She thought about the well fixed before the freeze. The gate closed carefully behind him. The chair sized exactly right for a child who didn't want another father, and had gotten instead a man who taught her rope splicing and lost at checkers with dignity. She thought about her own name in his mouth, set down like something kept safe. "The arrangement was always a little thin," she said. "I knew it when I wrote it." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the way light changes on snow when the clouds break. "I know," he said. "The bargain was just the beginning," she said. "I know that too," he said. She reached out and set her hand over his where it rested on the kitchen counter, and he turned his hand over slowly and held hers, and that was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of thing that, once done, you cannot imagine not having done, and the kitchen felt warmer than the stove alone could account for. They were married in March, when the snow began to break and the roads came back. Reverend Platt read a short service in the parlor, because Eleanor did not want a fuss, and Wyatt had agreed that a fuss was unnecessary. Clara stood between them, holding Eleanor's hand on one side, and after a moment's consideration, Wyatt's on the other. A decision she made on her own without prompting, and which nobody commented on because some things do not need commentary. Wyatt had made a small shelf in the weeks before the ceremony and fitted it to the wall beside the kitchen window, at a height that caught the morning light. He had not said what it was for. Eleanor put her blue ceramic pitcher on it, the one she'd carried from Missouri, and it caught the light perfectly, and she understood that he had measured the light before he measured the shelf, and she did not tell him she knew because she liked knowing it privately. The surveyor came in April. The stakes held. The creek line was confirmed as Eleanor's. Harlan Goss's counterclaim was dismissed by the county registrar without ceremony, and Goss sent no further men to the Marsh property. What he thought of the outcome, nobody reported. What happened on the Marsh property that spring was a different matter entirely. The well ran clear and cold. The cattle came through winter in better shape than Eleanor had dared hope, and a second armchair appeared in the parlor, built from the same white oak as Clara's, sized for a grown woman. Wyatt set it beside the stove without comment. Eleanor sat in it that evening and looked at him across the firelight. "You could have asked what size," she said. "I know your size," he said, not looking up from the rope he was splicing. She laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that comes from a place that has not been reached in a while, and it warmed the room in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. What those two people built in Caldera Creek was not what either of them had planned. Eleanor had planned for help. Wyatt had planned, if he'd planned at all, for somewhere to be useful and to stay. Neither of them had written love into the arrangement, because love is not something you can legislate in a notice tacked to a post outside a general store. But love is also not something that waits to be invited. It comes in through practical doors, through a gate carefully closed, a well recased before the freeze, a chair built to the right size for a child who didn't ask for it, a name said quietly in a kitchen as the snow came down. You cannot always name the moment it arrives. You can only look up one day and find it has been there for a while, making itself at home. If you have ever made a bargain that became something more than a bargain, or if you've known someone who kept a promise beyond what the words required, tell us about it in the comments below. Stories like Eleanor's and Wyatt's are not as rare as you might think, and every one of them deserves to be remembered. If this one found its way into your heart, subscribe so you don't miss the next journey down these old frontier roads. Good night. God bless you and yours. May you always find what you need in the most unlikely of places.